Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about when it comes to the Great Depression is the fact that it was a global phenomenon. That means it just didn't impact the United States, it affected the whole world. With all of the business that we do with Europe and Europe does with Asia, and we truly, by this time, are in a global economy. So if something bad economically happens to one country, that's going to affect the other countries. And something like this just had a global reach. Now, we want to take a look at some of the responses in Europe and in Asia, and then compare that with what the United States decided to do. In Italy, Italy was hit particularly hard by the Great Depression, and they ended up turning to a dictator by the name of Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist. That means he uh, basically took control of the government and built up the military and really took control of the economy and uh, kind of projected himself as the savior from this economic collapse and from the communists as well. Communism, if you remember from your studies in world history, uh, the idea behind communism was that capitalism, a free market system, uh, would eventually destroy itself, and communism, excuse me, communism would eventually take over the world. And so all of the communists in Europe and around the world at this time thought, okay, this is it. This is where capitalism goes in the toilet and communism is going to spread throughout the globe at this point. And it was very much a threat in Europe at this time as well. Japan turned to militarism, to the building up of their military and military expansion. They turned to that tactic to solve its economic problems. There was a military dictator in power at the time. His name was Hideki Tojo, and he saw that Japan needed to expand and take over territories in China and in Asia in order to solve its problems. Of course, the most famous example in Europe is that of Germany. Germany turned to a dictator that everyone knows by the name of Adolf Hitler, and he promised to save the nation from this depression and from communism as well. And one of the things that he did to deal with the depression after taking control of the government was to build up the military. And so uh, the other countries in Europe, countries such as France and England, they decided to go another route. They basically turned into something called welfare capitalism. That means the government is now taking the responsibility for providing um, the basic needs for the people, whereas that hadn't necessarily been the case, at least at this level. Now I want to turn to the effects of the Great Depression in the U.S. itself. The big question is, what would the United States do? There were some people in the United States that wanted to turn to some sort of fascism, that wanted to, people on the left-hand side wanted to turn to a form of welfare state like parts of Europe had done as well. So what would the United States do? Would this capitalistic system that we'd had for so many years, would that collapse? Would that be destroyed? Would there be a new order in the United States? This was very much a time for panic by many people in the American population. Let's look at some of the effects at home. One of the major effects was, of course, unemployment. Unemployment was as high as 25%. Some figures say even as high as 33%. Unemployment was very big, and that led to a rise in vagrancy. There were people that were simply without homes. There were a lot of men that simply left town and hitched a ride on a train and became a hobo. There were a lot of people that just kind of lived that sort of existence. one of the major things that it did, most people, again, people talk about hobos and people starving to death and things like that. That was not um, most people. Most people um, were not that adversely affected by the Great Depression to where they would have to, where they would starve to death or something of that nature. But it did put dreams on hold. A lot of people had goals in life of maybe getting an education or having a large family or getting married or starting their own business. The typical things that we associate with the American dream, well, a lot of people had to put those on hold. They knew that they couldn't have the 5 kids that they wanted because they just simply couldn't afford them, or they knew that they couldn't get married because they couldn't afford to do that as well. So a lot of people had to put those goals, put those dreams on hold. And the birth rate did decline dramatically during the Great Depression. There was a psychological toll on the American population. For example, if you were out of work and if you were used to providing for your family, and you were unable to have a job, unable to hold a job, unable to provide for your family, that dealt a serious blow to many many men's idea of self-worth because they were not fulfilling their role in the household, and many people cracked under the pressure and became a hobo, or some people even deserted their family, which was quite sad. Um, on a positive note, most people learn to tighten their belt. Most people learn to do without. Most people became very economical in the way they handled resources. They made wiser decisions. They really were able to survive off of much less than they had had previously. So many people tightened their belt and were very frugal and thrifty during this period. When people talk about so and so grew up during the Great Depression, they'll often tell stories about, oh yeah, they would always clean their plate. They would never let any food go to waste. They would always everything that they got, they saved. They would use every part of it. They wouldn't throw anything away. We hear stories about those types of people that grew up during that time. Uh, the Great Depression really, literally forged a generation of these types of people that were very economical in the way they handled resources. Minorities. I want to touch on minority groups, and for African Americans and Mexican Americans during this time, the depression was a lot worse because usually the first person fired from the job or the first person laid off was the people of color, which was a sad commentary on just the general state of racism in the nation at the time. And also, they received a greater amount of persecution during this time because there were fewer jobs available and people saw them as competing for these jobs. So they really endured a higher unemployment rate and a greater amount of persecution as well. Another aspect I want to mention is charity. Uh, there were one of the iconic images of the Great Depression were soup kitchens and bread lines. There were a lot of generous people during this time that donated money to establish soup kitchens, places that were open that people could line up and get a free meal, or bread lines where people could line up and get a free loaf of bread. There were, again, not everyone was poor during this time. But there was still a large segment of the population that was doing well, that was doing okay, and there were many forms of charity during this time, that had never been seen before in American history. I want to talk a little bit about Herbert Hoover. He is today, I think, one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. Um, if you talk to someone at the time, and I've talked to many people at this time, they still bear a grudge against Herbert Hoover, and this was back in the late 20s, uh, early 1930s. A lot of people today are registered Democrats because of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a Republican. They blamed Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression, so therefore the whole rest of their life they're going to vote the other way because they have a grudge against Herbert Hoover. Well, who is Herbert Hoover? And does he deserve this reputation of being one of the worst presidents in American history? Well, Herbert Hoover was actually a self-made man. He was not from a wealthy family, but uh, worked hard. He was a rugged individualist. He earned an education and became a mining engineer, and he eventually became quite wealthy because of his skills in that field. He became famous worldwide after World War I because he was instrumental in organizing relief to people in Germany and in Europe after World War I. Europe was absolutely devastated. There were millions of people